Welcome to the tasting portion of the Sustainability in Wine Country online series hosted by Cork and Fork in Logan Circle, Washington, D.C. My name is Antoinette Landragin, and it is a pleasure to be with you today. This is a guided tasting masterclass with Mark Davidson, Head of Education Development in North America with Wine Australia. We will start this class with a brief introduction, followed by our guest speaker's presentation and introduction to the wines we will taste. These wines are available for purchase at Cork and Fork. Simply email us at info@corkandfork.co to place an order. This is the 7th masterclass in the Sustainability in Wine Country series, focusing on sustainability in viticulture. The first masterclass of this series addressed the efforts made by New Zealand wine growers in their sustainability movement. We then heard from the Lodi Rules team with Dr. Stephanie Bolton. Staying with the Californian focus, after Lodi Rules, we heard from the Fish-Friendly Farming Certification Program of the California Land Stewardship Institute, hosted by Laurel Marcus. Following, we hosted Dr. Marty Longbottom, Sustainability and Viticulture Manager at the Australian Wine Research Institute. Last week, we enjoyed Anna Britton's presentation on Napa Green. Earlier this week, we had the great pleasure of learning about the South African wine industry sustainability movement from Jim Clark. And this evening, we are honored to host a tasting with Mark Davidson of Wine Australia. The wines we will taste this evening are active members of the Sustainable Wine Australia program. As mentioned, we had the great pleasure of hosting Dr. Marty Longbottom for a review of this program. We will direct all viewers to visit our YouTube page and watch this recording with Dr. Longbottom for that overview, and the link will be in the description below. In short, Sustainable Wine Growing Australia is Australia's national program for grape growers and winemakers to demonstrate and continuously improve their sustainability in the vineyard and winery through the environmental, social, and economic aspects of their businesses. It fosters stronger relationships between growers, wineries, and their regions. It also provides authority and confidence to distributors and retailers who receive reliable, certified produce to address growing global consumer demands. During this tasting class with Mark, we will review 6 wines: the 2021 Sémillon from Brokenwood in the Hunter Valley, the 2021 Pewsey Vale Vineyard Riesling from Eden Valley, the 2017 Yangarra Estate Vineyard Roux, Beaute, Roussanne from McLaren Vale, the 2019 Yalumba Samuel's Collection Grenache Bush Vine from the Barossa, the 2017 Leeuwin Estate Cabernet Sauvignon Prelude Vineyards from Margaret River, and we will finish with the 2018 Darrenberg The Lovegrass Shiraz from the McLaren Vale. Our guide and host for this tasting, as mentioned, is Mark Davidson. Mark started his career in Sydney before moving to Canada. While in Canada, he began a wine school, a path which eventually led him to working with Wine Australia. Mark is one of the most knowledgeable and humble members of the wine trade, and we are delighted to have him here this evening. We are excited to introduce you, our viewers, to Mark, and delighted to now begin the presentation. Thank you to all for being a part of this Sustainability in Wine Country series. We hope you enjoy it. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Antoinette. I'll pull up my screen. And humble, depends on the day of the week and the time of day, but yeah, I guess mostly I'm humble. Okay, so I'm going to whip through a presentation on biodynamic and organic wine as it pertains, as a sort of a general overview, and also how it pertains to some of the things we're doing in Australia. I'll keep that fairly brief, scan through some of it. A lot of this information is available. It's basically taken directly from our education website, Australian Wine Discovered, which you can see at the bottom of the slides here. So it's all downloadable, editable, you can access it all you like. So I'll whip through that, and then we'll get to the wines and taste the wines. And yeah, so let's get started, shall we? So we look at this biodynamic and organic viticulture. Some of the other environmental considerations. I think one of the cool things that we want to look at is the rise in these alternative varieties. And then we're going to taste the most important piece of the puzzle. For those of you with the 6 wines, I would suggest you get your impressions now. I'm going to spend 10 or 15 minutes just talking a bit about talking through this presentation, but start getting some of the impressions on the wines, and then yeah, we'll take it from there. So essentially, we have some of the largest amount of certified organic agricultural land in the world. That's overall agriculture, not necessarily specific to viticulture. But this whole discussion point around organics, biodynamics, sustainability, it's been something that's been pushed forward for a long, long time. And it's just, this is the future. This is where we're heading. And this is what we have to do. And I always like to sort of remind people that, you know, you go into buying your food at all sorts of stores where there's all sorts of label ingredients, and you know exactly the, you know, for the most part where the food has come from. Not so much with wine. And I think that a lot of these practices and sort of being a bit more authentic and transparent about how things are being grown and your wines are being made, I think is an important piece of the puzzle. So key concepts: organic viticulture, pretty straightforward. This is with no synthetic or artificial additives, chemicals, herbicides, pesticides. That's pretty much straightforward organic viticulture, grape growing. Certified organic winemaking process. Not all wines labeled organic are necessarily certified. I think that's important to remember. Possibly more important to remember is that photo, because that photo is from Yangarra, and the wine in one of your glasses was in one of those concrete eggs. And I'll explain that later. I'm not sure whether it's Sunny or Goog or whoever it is in here, but your wine, the Roussanne Beaute, is from one of these things. That's the winemaker there. Biodynamics, some of you might be comfortable with it or know a bit about it, but it's kind of an extension of organic viticulture with a little bit of sort of, you know, phases of the moon. And there's some practices where you sort of have, there's a little bit of leap of faith with some of these practices. And I think there's a lot of debate around some of the biodynamic viticultural practices. Some people say, oh, they're not necessarily proven, or there's this, that, and the other. The reality is there's some, whether, you know, reproducible or not, there's some really cool things happening in this space. And I think how Australia is starting to adopt them, and some of our better winemakers adopting them wholesale, or at least taking elements of biodynamic viticulture, is really important. And I'll leave this, this is just the three basic approaches. So conventional would be using sprays, organic, no use of sprays, and then this further step drawn on these ideas from Rudolf Steiner, who actually got his teachings from a woman called Maria Thuden in quite some time ago. The reason people get a bit funny about biodynamics is that some of these ideas you just have to not question, you just adopt them wholesale. Some of the ideas came to Rudolf Steiner while he was in a trance. That sometimes is bothersome to people, but that doesn't take away from the fact that just because there's the science hasn't caught up to some of the practices doesn't make them not valid. I think it's interesting to look at. And I'll skip through this because there's just elements about phases of the moon are an incredibly important piece of the puzzle. And the thing that made me stop and think about biodynamics is just sometimes the way wines taste. And they talk about the lunar calendar and how that affects how wines express themselves in the glass. And I thought that was rubbish at first. And then there's no question that there's something to do with either it's barometric pressure or phase of the moon or a bit of both. So I'm not sure. So fruit days, root days, flower days, leaf days, worth digging into if you're interested. All sorts of other interesting things. Now, everyone who says, oh, Australia, climate change must be a real hassle. Well, everyone's dealing with climate change. This is not just an Australian issue. We happen to have a fairly warm, dry climate in many areas, so people want to sort of dive into that. But we've also been incredibly sort of responsive to a lot of the issues that are going on with climate change. So, and you know, some of the things that you need to do to adapt to it. And one of the things I will address is, as we go through this, is the very interesting grape varieties that are being planted and how people are adapting their vineyard sites. Carbon neutrality, energy efficiency, there's just this whole list of things here. I won't go through them, but just in general, you're trying to utilize or minimize and reduce fuel uses, refrigeration, switching to different types of energy efficient heating methods, switching to lighter weight bottles, fewer carbon emissions, less fuel for transport, installing solar panels, all the sorts of things you're starting to see in many businesses, not just in viticulture, agriculture, and winemaking. This is a fascinating subject, just this whole concept. One of the biggest problems with wine or grape growing historically is it's monoculture. Actually, historically it wasn't monoculture, but we've made it monoculture. So it's one particular thing being grown in a particular plot of land, which is problematic. It has created this lack of diversity. So a lot of the biodynamic and organic practices are about increasing biological diversity in the soils, and also that has a really strong impact on the water retention and all sorts of other really cool things about how the vines grow. this thing I dropped in the bottom here, lots of work in understanding the mycorrhizal fungi. These are the sort of really interesting sort of fungi, parts of the fungi family that do really good things in the soils, and they attach themselves to the roots, and they actually end up being pathogen resistant. And there's some really cool work being done in that space. So for those of you who want to geek out, dig into that. Composting, mulching, you've seen this with all sorts of agriculture, no different in viticulture. Some cool case studies that are worth looking at. We are a dry country. Water is an important piece of the puzzle with grape growing and winemaking, and we've had to be very, very economical historically. And so we've got some really world-leading, interesting elements happening with with water management in Australia. Irrigation is necessary in parts of Australia, but a lot of these older vines that we have we're finding they don't need that much irrigation, especially if you're going to do some interesting vineyard practices, a couple of which are happening with some of the wines that we've got today. Worth looking into what McLaren Vale's doing. They're sort of leading the world in what they've done with managing the groundwater aquifers, treating reclaimed water from Adelaide and reusing that in the winery. Reclaimed water, by that we mean treating grey water, like bath water and what have you. We're not talking about sewage water, but bath water. And so, that's actually a really good and efficient way of utilizing water, making sure that the surface catchment dams that collect and store runoff water as well when the rain does come. Other elements, integrated pest management is about sort of adapting, making sure the pests in your vineyard site are actually competing and out-competing the pests that could be problematic. And that's an important piece of the puzzle in creating these sort of pathways for pests to survive and do well in these environments that actually end up meaning you don't need to use sprays that you might be using for pesticides. Using animals, recycling, no different from other businesses, but just all these sorts of elements people are paying attention to and trying to be more responsible with their management of waste, recycling and waste. Now we'll get to some fun stuff. Not that this isn't fun, but alternative varieties are an important piece of the puzzle in Australia, and I find this fascinating and exciting. You have to think where we went in the early days in Australia was we Busby and the original guys that collected all the grape varieties and brought them to Australia. They went to the places that were famous at the time, and in the mid 1800s that was France. It was also Spain and Portugal, because fortified wines are important, and on their way through South Africa was a stop when they came around the Cape. So the reality is that we went with that. Now, we could easily have gone with Italian varieties, but nobody was really talking about Italian wines back in those days. Everyone was just drinking wine in Italy, but they weren't really focused on high quality in those days. So some of these varieties are now starting to make their way to Australia, and there's a really good reason for it. A lot of it's to do with Southern Mediterranean varieties doing really, really well in this changing environment, hanging on to acidity, being fresher and more natural in those warmer environments, and also using less water, which is an interesting element too. And all of this is about making it exciting and interesting. And I would argue that the full tapestry of Australian wine styles and varieties right now is about as exciting as you'll find anywhere. And people still probably have this idea, oh, I've heard of your Shiraz, I've heard of your Chardonnays, but there's just so much more to Australia right now. And I think it's really exciting. You need a little taste of it tonight, some classics and others. So for those of you that haven't seen the presentation that Marty Longbottom did from the AWRI, awesome, very detailed, talks about sustainable wine growing in Australia. Just as a reminder, we don't have full membership across the country, but that's the ultimate aim. There's 48 regions represented right now, just under 800 members. So yeah, it's kind of cool. 36% of what's being crushed in Australia is certified or sustainable under the various boards that maintain the sustainable wine growing Australia. Now we get to do the fun stuff. Let's taste. Not grapes, wine. Grapes made into wine. Okay, the first place actually let me just address the the challenge when you're doing a tasting talking about sustainability. It's not like I can say, wow, can you taste the biodynamics in that glass, or can you taste the sustainability of that? It's suffice to say that when we selected the wines through Antoinette's store, the idea was all of these wineries are members of SWA, or Sustainable Wine Growing Australia. So they're all part of those, and they're working towards various degrees of either certification or just membership in there and doing all the right things. So there's nothing in this tasting where there isn't attention to detail in the vineyard and in the winery. So that's kind of cool. So we've got some nice classic styles to start with. And then as I go through, we'll just taste the wines and see what you think of them, and see if you can garner the characteristics you think are interesting. And then when there are cool, interesting practices, I've got a couple of slides and I'll point them out as we go through. First place we're going to is Hunter Valley, which is one of the more historic areas in Australia, because the original grapes came into Sydney and they were planted around Sydney, but it's a bit sort of challenging there. And the Hunter Valley, just now about 2 hours north of Sydney, one of the most established old regions in Australia, along with, as you head down into the Barossa and what have you. So not far from Sydney, sort of tropical, subtropical climate up there. So a little bit challenging, but the style of Sémillon that comes out of it is unique. And I think Jancis Robertson said, this is Australia's gift to the wine world, if you ever had a chance to try old Sémillons. So this is picked really early. Look at the alcohol content, 11.2%. That is low, and that's because it's picked early and all the magic happens in the bottle. And right now you've got a very young version of it, which is just very lemony and simple and straightforward. These wines have tremendous age worthiness, but fruit for this is sourced from across the region. Nothing particularly, the first two wines, I love them because there's not a lot of winemaking artifice in any of these first two wines. It's about picking the fruit in pristine condition, fermenting in stainless steel, and putting it in the bottle. There's no oak additions or any oak aging or anything. It's about the purity of fruit coming straight out of the vineyard site. So that first wine, I don't have all 6. I've got most of them, so I'll work our way through it. But the cool thing about Sémillon from the Hunter Valley is that crispness. I would argue there's no single better, if you're a fan of fresh oysters, no single better wine for fresh oysters on the shell, half shell, than Sémillon. And I've done this with all my wine friends. We try Chablis, is delicious, Muscadet is delicious, but this lemony nature of the Brokenwood is exactly what you want. Aside from it being an aperitif wine, it's just a lovely thing to drink. It's delicious with oysters, and it's actually, I've used this more often than I tend to have wine most nights, and if I'm thinking about what I'm cooking, sometimes while I'm deciding what wine I want to have, I need to have a glass of wine while I decide what wine I'm going to have. This fits the bill. A glass of Brokenwood Sémillon, or a Sémillon from the Hunter in general, is a good contemplative wine that helps you make your decision for your next bottle. Maybe that's just me with an issue, but we shall see. Cool. Brokenwood Sémillon, juicy, lovely, delicious. I've actually got a tiny sip of it left still. It's all about that lemony, fresh, vibrant characteristic. And the interesting thing is, you look at this wine, you think, oh wow, it's tasty, it's lemony, it's fresh. Does it age? And these wines have ridiculous age worthiness. I've had 40 and 50-year-old Sémillons from the Hunter Valley, and they that crisp acidity just sort of turns a corner. It becomes sort of almost creme brulee-like and lemony, and yeah, lovely stuff. It's strange, but none of us have the patience for aging wines anymore. But if you can keep your grubby little hands off of this, put this away for a few years, because it actually has tremendous age worthiness. The next string of wines are actually from various parts of South Australia. The cool thing about South Australia is there's so many regions in South Australia that are famous, and they're all clumped together right around the town of Adelaide. And we're going to focus on a couple of regions that are doing really, really good things with sustainability. First up, this is love. These are part of, you can see they're holding up the Sustainable Wine Growing Australia picture there. That's Louisa Rose on the left. This is one of the very special vineyard sites I've ever been to, period. And I'm lucky I've traveled to all parts of the world for wine travel. This is a really special spot. This was originally planted in the 1960s. It was actually planted in 1847. I don't know what was planted back there, but the Robert Hill Smith from the Yalumba family bought the vineyard in his, I think his uncle or his grandfather or somebody bought the vineyard in 1961, and it was planted to Riesling. They've played around with some other varieties, and they've just pulled them out and said, no, this is a Riesling site. So the old vineyards here, the old vines here have been in the ground since 1961. It's technically an old vine Riesling. It's at about 1,500 meters above sea level. Rocky, skeletal, challenging conditions, can be windy and cold. I've taken perverse pleasure in taking trade from parts of the US, Australia, all over the place up there, and they go, Riesling grown in Australia, it's too hot, isn't it? And then you stand up there freezing your butt off. with people wanting to get back in the car. It's like, wow, it's a very, very special place. And they're doing some cool practices. One of the things that we're seeing more and more of is this mulching below the vines. Henschke's doing, lots of people are doing it. So the idea is, number one, it keeps weeds down, but it also retains what little water might happen in a challenging, say, maybe a drought-prone year. You get a bit of moisture retention, no need for irrigation, even though irrigation lines are here. They haven't been irrigating in this vineyard for a while. And the reality is that this has been biodynamic since 2011. They're certainly certified organic, but they've been biodynamic since 2000. It's just this, yeah, you're sitting at 500 meters above sea level in this vineyard site in the middle of nowhere now. So you can imagine it was planted in 1847. It must have been quite the trek to get up there. But one of the very, very special vineyard sites I've ever been to, and it's a real pleasure. And so what you're tasting in the glass, though, little step up, little change in citrus profile, I think, that you're getting from this particular wine is it more sort of tends towards that lime-like sort of quality, whereas it was very simple sort of lemon in the Sémillon. A little bit more body, a little bit more weight, and just that sort of lime-like kind of quality. I don't know if anyone, yeah, like just think about sort of freshly zested lime, and I think that's the beautiful thing about Eden Valley Riesling. And this specifically, I love this wine, and I just think it's one of the great delicious wines to have. So that's it, beautiful Riesling. And the nice thing is, for those of you trying it, we do still have a problem with Riesling, and that is that people think, oh, it's sweet, isn't it? So, well, except when it's not, and this is not. This is a delicious example of dry Riesling. This is something that Australia's done for years. There are some wines with a little more residual sugar, but this is a classic example of a really, really well-made, crisp, beautiful lemon lime sort of definition to this, which I would argue is maybe one of the classic sort of Rieslings produced, certainly in Australia, if not anywhere. So hopefully you enjoyed that. I love it. I can't get enough of it. That would be also a delicious, I actually think the gastronomic profile on this wine is a little broader, and you can kind of go to different places with this in terms of, it's certainly a good contemplative wine, but I think there's lots of dishes that this would work with goat cheese and light seafood dishes. It's a lovely wine. Cool. Pewsey. And that straw gets replaced. Usually it lasts a couple of years and have to put the straw back down again. That's an ongoing thing. So that picture earlier on, there's a picture in the presentation that I said, pay attention, because the wine came from one of those concrete egg fermenters. But this is it. So I'm going to show you a picture of the vineyard site. Yangarra is really a brilliant place. It's a wonderful place to visit. They've got all sorts of vines in the ground, but they have all permitted varieties for Chateauneuf du Pape as well, just by chance, and I'll show you that in a moment. But this was planted in 2002, so the vines are getting some interesting age. It's just one particular, where this comes from is one particular 1.5 hectare site, old sandy soils, the underlying geology in McLaren Vale is old. This isn't particularly old, this is older, but this is 54 million years old. This is a certified organic and biodynamic producer, but they've done some cool things in the fermentation of this. Half of the fermentation was taken off the stems and crushed and fermented in concrete eggs, and they left the skins in there for 193 days, which is a long time. That's where the savory sort of almost textural element comes from. The other half is pressed into the ceramic eggs, just the juice, and then fermented. So those two are then blended together. I love the direction this wine's been going in. It gives you this weight and intensity that I think is Roussanne. It's almost slightly honeycomb and sort of almost straw-like qualities, I think, on the palate. And just wonderful length and texture, and yeah, beautiful stuff. And this is the site. So this is the whole sort of vineyard block. And I love this map simply because, I don't know, I just like maps. But some of the famous wines that Yangarra produced are pointed out here. But Rue Beaute is just this little section here. Look at all the other varieties that in the single blocks they explain it, but look at all the other varieties here. Shiraz, Grenache, Mourvèdre, Grenache Gris, Carignan, Cinsault, Cunoise, Picpoul Noir, Muscardin, all the varieties that you see in the Southern Rhone. So they technically make their own sort of local Chateauneuf du Pape blend, but they tend to be playing with these varieties separately rather than blending them in. They do some GSMs and a few other different things, but no, it's a really cool estate, and are never sitting back on their hands doing things the way they used to. They're always playing around with new techniques and new varieties, and I love that. I think it's cool. This is an interesting sequence of photos. Pete Fraser, the winemaker, told me that this is pre-biodynamics in the vineyard. very dramatic. You love, this is Grenache, actually. It's not the Roussanne. This is Grenache grown on sandy soils. We love Grenache being grown on sandy soils. This is the character of the soils pre-biodynamic viticulture. Now look at the vineyard site, same vineyard site. Look at the biodiversity that they're trying to create between the vines. Obviously it's a different time of year, but you kind of get a good sense of where this place is right now. So beautiful stuff that they're doing. Yeah, I'd love to see if anyone's got any comments about that particular wine. Great. If not, no drama. But next is one of my pet things. I love what's happening with Grenache in Australia. Could easily have done the Yalumba, the Yangarra Grenache, but we thought we'd go to Barossa for this particular wine. Grenache is a funny one in Australia in that it's been around forever. It was one of the original varieties that came into the country. Kind of got relegated to a great blending variety and fantastic for port production. And we made a lot of fortified wines in the old day. The inherent characteristics of Grenache, when you handle it properly, are now starting to be understood and recognized as a much broader sort of palette of flavors and styles. And I think this is a wonderful example of that sort of almost modern. But this is sourced from various sites across the Barossa. Yalumba's was the first winery anywhere to get an award from the Environmental Protection Agency for what they were doing in terms of restoration in and around the vineyard, their carbon neutrality, all the practices they've been doing in and around the winery. So that's pretty good. Family-run business, not a small business, but it's still a family-run business, which I think is awesome. Sourcing fruit from various growers across the Barossa, including some of their own vineyard sites. Average age are all old vines. They're all old bush vines, as you can see on the label. Average age of about 70 years. So, that's not super old for Australia, but that's pretty good. Straightforward fermentation here and using old wood for the maturation. And I think that's why you get this lovely kind of savory quality, but then there's just this juicy, gorgeous, perfumed, lovely red fruited quality. And I think that's the future of Grenache in Australia generally, but certainly a great example from Yalumba in terms of that modernization of what essentially is a really classic old variety. And it's interesting because while I think there's a lot of fascination for new varieties coming in and their adaptability, there's now an inherent recognition of actually all along Grenache has been a very, very suited variety for many parts of Australia and is adaptable to this changing environment as well. Just management practices needed to be adjusted, and yeah, not sitting in the shadows behind Shiraz and other varieties anymore. It's kind of a cool variety, and I think it's a nice transition wine. Some of the producers in the Barossa call it warm climate Pinot, and I first heard that and I thought that's kind of weird, being a Pinophile that I am, and then I thought, oh, hang on, there's some truth to this. It's different than Pinot, but it's lighter in color, it's fragrant, a little bit richer in body, but it's just that there is this beautiful, fragrant, almost ethereal quality that you can get from Grenache that you quite often get from Pinot. I wouldn't compare them as the same, but I kind of thought that was a nice way to look at it. And these are some old vines. This is actually from one of their old sites. Some of the fruit from wine goes into that. Some of the fruit from this vineyard goes into that wine. This is planted in 1889. This is the tricentenary vineyard, so that's kind of cool. There's a lot of old vines like this in Australia, and people do get shocked when they see this because it's a really important piece of our heritage. And management practices around here, these vines have been thriving long before any pesticides and chemicals were even ever being used. So now, with the changing in some of the vineyard practices, they're proving their worth. Over to the other side of the country, to Margaret River. Now, I have to be careful because I'm not allowed in my role to like one region more than the other. But if I was allowed to, this would be one of them. McLaren Vale and then Margaret River. They're two very, very special places. Now, if you've ever been, you'll know what I'm talking about. But Perth is the most remote, large city you'll find anywhere. It's a good 5-hour flight to get over to Perth from 4.5, 5-hour flight from Sydney. So it's like going LA to New York. But there's no other major cities around. It's just on its own. Beautiful city, awesome city. And then you've still got another 3-hour drive to get down to Margaret River. And there's just something particularly special. You've got the ocean on 3 sides. You've got just the vegetation, the general sort of lay of the land, the topography and land is really, really special. And we're going to one of the great estates. I love Cabernet from Australia. I particularly like it from Coonawarra. There's some good stuff in McLaren Vale, but oh man, when push comes to shove, Cabernet from Margaret River is something really, really special. And it's been noted now for the last 20 years. It's an interesting region in the sense that a lot of old vines existed and the regions were developed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. This has only just celebrated its 50th anniversary. 1967 was the first serious plantings in Margaret River. Leeuwin was shortly behind that, but they're in that sort of grouping of the early pioneers in the region. 90% Cabernet, 91% Cabernet is effectively a Cabernet Sauvignon with a little Merlot, and Malbec is creeping into the picture in Margaret River. Malbec does really well in Margaret River, and you're starting to see more and more of it. Not necessarily a single varietal, but the increased proportions in the blend with Cabernet-based wines. I just love this because I think it's nice to be reminded that, and I think we're inundated, and not a criticism, just an observation, we're inundated with big full-bodied Cabernets, and it's nice to be reminded that Cabernet can be medium-bodied and kind of fragrant and not necessarily big and smack you around the face. Both are good, both styles exist, but this is that really sort of fragrant sort of element that I just find really appealing about Cabernet from Margaret River. So yeah, not a lot of new oak in this one. That's sort of, it seems to be a trend in Australia, backing away from it. And again, they are members of Sustainable Wine Growing Australia. So, and a wonderful family. There's a nice little California connection too, because they were not winemakers, grape growers. It was, they bought a property down in Margaret River. His wife, Dennis Horgan's wife, said presumably because Dennis wanted the place to be close to really good surfing. It's awesome surfing in Margaret River. And then someone was walking through their property with a group of people, and it was Robert Mondavi. Back in the early 70s, he thought that Margaret River would be a great place for Chardonnay, and they said, "Do you want to sell?" And they said, "No, we don't want to sell." I said, "Why? What do you want to do with this?" And they said, "Well, we want to plant grapes and grow, make Chardonnay." And he's like, "Well, we don't want to sell. So tell you what, we'll commission you to help us out." And then consequently, Robert Mondavi helped them with the production of wine in general there, but their Chardonnay, day in, day out, is one of the most awarded Chardonnays ever produced in Australia. It's right up there with the great wines produced in Australia. And so Robert Mondavi is a pretty smart cookie. So he had something about this site that he thought was really special. But today you're trying the Cabernet, which I think is also just delicious. And the nice thing too is that I mean, it's on the sheets, I think, in terms of how much this is. It might be what, $35 or is it $30? Where do you get top-notch Cabernet from a specific place, Napa or wherever, for that kind of money that has this beautiful expression? I really think this is a magic wine that speaks of its place, speaks of the varieties that are in there, specifically Cabernet, for unbelievable value. And I think that's a beautiful thing. Back to South Australia for our last, but certainly not least wine. McLaren Vale, Lovegrass. So the story behind this, it sounds like there's a few stories involved with Lovegrass, but it's not nearly as I don't know, lascivious as it might seem. But there's this type of grass in this vineyard site that sticks to your pants during the harvest. There's these little buds that come off the grass, and Chester's like, "Hey, they seem to love us. This grass seems to love us." So it calls it the Lovegrass Shiraz. So here's it's mostly Shiraz. Then there's 15% other varieties, 9 of them, but he doesn't say what. So it's mostly Shiraz with other stuff in it, which is kind of cool. So they just sort of harvested together. I love what D'Arenberg's done historically. I don't think there's anyone that spent more time when travel was possible than D'Arenberg. Chester Osborne from D'Arenberg in the early days, he came out, everyone knows him, doing wonderful things here, making very classic styled Shiraz from McLaren Vale. He does beautiful Grenache, plays around with all sorts of different varieties. He is basically 100% crazy, but all the good parts of crazy, and he'd be happy that I said that. He is really quite the character. This is a picture of actually one of the vineyard sites nearby, and there's a picture of Chester. He kind of looks like the Joker out of the Batman series, but he's a wonderful character, and he's built he's built his reputation on preservation of vineyards, low impact in the vineyards. They restored, when they were going around looking for vineyard sites, they were realizing that a lot of these old vine Shiraz, but also old vine Grenache vineyard sites were really important to preserve, and they're back to very, very, very sustainable practices. He's also built a cube. There's this controversial winery that he's built that just looks like a big cube. I probably should have put a photo in there, and I love it because he's bringing people to a wine region that are not interested in wine, but they're having a wine experience in this cube. And I think that's an important thing. I think we get a bit stuck in how we think things should be, but cool. Well, that's all of the wines I ripped through there. So if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them, but let me stop sharing for a moment there. And yeah, that was a lot in a half an hour. 35 minutes.
Yeah, you did an amazing job, Mark. I think over the years, I've attended quite a few of your presentations at different sommelier and trade conferences around the country. And I know you can go at a good clip, but this definitely was one of the most compact and accelerated presentations, but there's definitely a lot of information that you shared with us, and I look forward personally to going back and watching the recording, so I can pick back up on the little bits and pieces that I might have missed.
I did have a student at one point when I was teaching classes in the sommelier classes, and she just moved to Vancouver from China, and she used to tape me and play me back at half speed. So okay, fair, I do speak quickly.
Absolutely. But you know, it's wonderful for us to stay in contact with what Australia is doing. I personally believe that Australian wine is well represented here, at least in Washington, D.C., but I'm looking forward to a lot more Australian wines coming to the market, just because there are so many incredible things that producers are doing over there. And you sort of touched on the Italian varieties that are out there. And I know Wine Australia is you guys have some amazing programs and recordings and outreach seminars for trade and consumers alike. So everyone watching, I strongly encourage you to go online and look at wineaustralia.com/education for what is one of the most comprehensive educational websites that I've seen to date. Would you agree, Mark, being
well, I'm biased. I'm biased and I help work on that. But yeah, absolutely. But I think one of the cool things about it was that it was designed, yeah, it's certainly very consumer friendly, but it was also designed for all levels of the trade to use. And the beauty is that all those presentations, you have to sign up. There's no fee to sign up, and it just to log in to get in there. You can download a whole PowerPoint on Grenache. And you can use it if you were doing a presentation, or you can use one slide and you can adapt it, put your own logos in there. It's there to be used and abused. And that's what we want. We want people out there using it and getting good information. There's a question about the wines. Are they available at Cork and Fork? And the answer would be yes. They're all at Cork and Fork.
Yes, 100%. And a very special thanks to you, Mark, for making this selection of wines. They're absolute beauties. And we encourage everyone watching this. If you don't live in DC locally, check out your local wine shops. Smaller shops would certainly carry them, and definitely pick them up. If you can't find those exact bottlings, pick up something from those producers. Mark, before we say goodnight to everyone, do you have any final thoughts to share with us tonight?
Not too much, other than, yeah, I think you made a comment about what's going on with Australia. There's just so much. And I think it's probably important to note that prior to working for Wine Australia, which I've done for about a decade now, I was a sommelier. I worked in restaurants in Canada and did teaching up and down the west coast of the US and in Canada. And I was working with the world of wine, and I was more sort of a specialist towards Europe and French wines. But the reality is that now, when I'm looking at what's going on in Australia, this has nothing to do with the fact that we're Wine Australia. It's a very exciting time. There's really, really good energy and authenticity and just diversity. And so when you wrap that up in the, with a lot of the sustainable practices that people are starting to employ, it's a really good time to be drinking Australian wines. You can say that about a lot of places around the world. A lot of excitement happening in places that, when I started in wine, Sicily you didn't even bother with wines from Sicily, and now it's a super exciting place. There's great wine from all corners of the globe, but I would argue one of the more exciting places to drink and to sort of, visit, which of course is a little challenging right now. Hopefully it's going to open up next year, is Australia. There's a lot of excitement. You'll never be bored. There's so many different styles, and you start playing around with some of the Italian varieties. Then you look at their sweet wines. There's wonderful sparkling wines. Yeah, every wine style possible it exists. So get out and explore. So And I think sometimes there's people that have, oh yeah, I know Australian wine. I've had some Shiraz. It's like, well, first of all, there's more to Australia than Shiraz. Second of all, if you haven't had a good Shiraz in a while, you'll see a big change. And so worth getting back. There was a Kellogg's commercial a while ago that said, try us again for the first time. I thought, oh, I wish I could steal that, but it's trademarked. But it's a great tagline because well-known things, people forget about them, and it's nice to go try them again for the first time, which I thought was kind of cool. So yeah, get out there, experiment, and just try a bunch of new things. So.
That's right, and not to forget the food culture that is a signature of the Australian wine and food culture, obviously. But yeah, you're absolutely right, and it's an exciting time, and we have plenty of wines for people to explore and experiment with. So come visit us, give us a call. We can ship you some wines. This is not a plug for Cork and Fork, but just check out wines from Australia anywhere in your local neighborhood. All right, well, wonderful. Thank you for your time and for hosting this presentation, Mark. It's really, yeah, it's an honor to have you. And for some people who would recognize you, you came to visit us a couple of years ago and you did an in-person tasting, which at the time was great and amazing, but I didn't realize how special that was since recently everything is online. So I hope one day that we're able to do something.
Oh, I'm just so tired of just talking to people like this. I love it because we can still connect, but it's so different when you can actually speak to the wine and then see people's reactions. And I've said this to my wife, I love drinking wine with my wife, but I'd like to have a glass of wine with someone else from time to time right now.
That's right. That day will come. It will come. So thank you to all for joining us. We look forward to featuring our next Sustainability in Wine Country event hosted by the Porto Protocol. Access to past masterclasses may be found on our YouTube page and at corkandfork.co. Also, we have a QR code at our checkout that you can scan, and it'll take you right to the YouTube page series where we have all of the recordings lined up and ready to go for you. And additional program details for the rest of our classes this year may be found on our website at corkandfork.co under calendar. Thank you again for joining us, Mark. Thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure.
Take care. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night.